All right. Hello, everybody. This is Barry, co-founder and CEO at Ivy, calling in from New York. I'm extremely excited to have with us today Chloé Valdary. Hey, Chloé, how's it going?
It's going well. How are you?
Very well. Thank you so much. I'm really excited for our conversation. I've been looking forward to it for several weeks now. And the topic couldn't be more relevant to what Ivy is all about. So we're going to be talking about how to affect change through genuine connection and really going to be focusing on your theory of enchantment. So to get us kicked off, if you could actually start with why this topic is important to you and how you got to developing this theory and how it fits in your overall life journey.
Oh, existential questions. Okay, my favorite. So the theory of enchantment is really a curriculum that is focused on mental health and healthy identity formation. In general, universal proposition. And the reason why this is very important to me is because in the past few years, over the last decade or so, we've seen an increase in anxiety, depression, and even suicidal thoughts among specifically teenagers and college students, but also more generally, the population in general. And there are a whole host of reasons for this, but one of the primary factors, at least among young people, is the increased use of screen time, and specifically on social media. So we have young people, for example, who have a very problematic sense of self that is being reinforced by a sort of sense of perfection, which is not a real thing. It doesn't really exist, but a sense of perfection or an image of perfection on platforms like Instagram and Snapchat. And they're trying to live up to that sense of perfection, and it's impossible because, again, perfection doesn't exist. And this is interfering with their mental health development, their sense of self-care, and their sense of self-empowerment. And in general, we've seen a lot of increases in, as I said, anxiety, depression, and the like among the population, regardless of age. So I really wanted to tackle that. And the way I got involved in this is kind of complicated, but I'll try to give you the elevator pitch version of it. So I'm from New Orleans. I went to the University of New Orleans. My major was international studies. So I was really primarily focused initially on conflict resolution. And I did that for a while, did that for a couple of years. And I realized that in order to tackle this issue of conflict resolution, I had to actually think about where the role that identity played in this space, the role that a healthy sense of identity played in the space of conflict resolution, and the role of an unhealthy identity, and how an unhealthy sense of self could actually lead to a breakdown in communication and more conflict. So I was at the Wall Street Journal for a year after I graduated from the University of New Orleans, where I was trying to think, how can I get people to, be better in terms of resolving conflict? How can I get them to develop different skill sets? And then I started to shift my way of thinking. I started to ask myself, instead of asking, how do I get people to not be in conflict? Why don't I ask myself the question, how do I get people to start loving? Which are not the same questions. They're interrelated questions, but they're not the same questions. And I discovered that this concept of love is actually a social skill set that has to be cultivated and developed over time. We're not necessarily born with this ability to love each other, right? And so from there, I was like, okay, well, if I want to know how do I get people to start loving, I have to ask, what are people already in love with? And how can I use that as a conduit to get them to social skill sets to love one another? And the big thing that I kept finding that people were in love with was pop culture. Right? Pop culture is the collection of the companies that we gravitate toward, the influencers, the singer-songwriters we gravitate toward. And I was curious if there was a common denominator between all of these companies. So in the middle of the research project, I started researching companies like Nike and Adidas. I started researching influencers like Beyonce. And at the time, he had just had a new album out. So folks like Justin Bieber, like what is the craze around these companies and these influencers? And I discovered that they had one thing in common. They were creating content where their audience saw themselves and their potential reflected in the content. So that's what Nike did fundamentally, right? When Nike has a t-shirt and attaches the slogan, just do it on it, the idea is that if you wear that t-shirt, whatever ambition, whatever objective you have in that one moment, you will feel like you can accomplish that goal. Similarly, when Beyonce says things like, "Who run the world? Girls," many women see themselves and their potential reflected in that, which is why a lot of women gravitate toward Beyonce. So this was sort of like the common denominator, the red thread that connected these influencers and companies and created our attachment to them. So from there, I was like, okay, well, that's interesting. Can I develop a series of principles? Can I develop a full curriculum that's basically all about that concept? That's basically all about human potential, right? And all about healthy identity formation and healthy sense of self, in order so that human beings will be more likely to be able to love one another, and in the process, de-escalate conflict and de-escalate tensions wherever they can be found over time.
I love that. So it's a very proactive approach to conflict resolution instead of, figuring out how to lessen tensions and so on, which is obviously important. That
Yes.
you're trying to get people to figure out how they can, love better and, cultivate like more of those positive emotions. And fascinatingly, you looked at pop culture
Yes.
For clues on how to get that done. So if you could, please, can you give us an outline of what the theory of enchantment, like what the key principles are, and walk us through kind of like what pop culture references best exemplify each of those principles?
Great question. Okay, so Theory of Enchantment has 3 principles. They're very simple. I'm going to go over them quickly, and then I'm going to try to break them down. So the first principle is, remember that we are human beings, not political abstractions. That's number 1. Number 2, criticize to uplift and empower, never to tear down, never to destroy. And number 3, root everything you do in love and compassion. So the first principle, remember that we are human beings, not political abstractions. This can seem obvious, but what I found is that it's not so obvious, especially because of social media. So when I say, remember that we are human beings, not political abstractions, what do I mean? Well, we often forget that to be a human being is actually a complex thing. We walk around often with a lot of baggage. We walk around with a lot of insecurity and feelings of inadequacy. That's not the only thing we walk around with. Sometimes we walk around also with great feelings of competence and confidence, right? But these are always at work internally within us. And our behavior often reflects those feelings. And so we need to train ourselves and train our brains to be aware of the fact that these things are actually at work within us. So if we find ourselves acting aggressive or acting defensively, we have to stop and ask ourselves, well, what is it that I'm feeling in this moment? Am I feeling insecure about something that happened at home or something that happened on the street? And am I taking that with me as baggage and carrying it into the school or into the workplace and projecting it as such, right? So a great pop culture reference that I like to talk about with this principle is Kendrick Lamar. And Kendrick Lamar is very, very important to the zeitgeist because he was the first hip hop artist to win a Pulitzer Prize for hip hop, right? So it's a very big deal. And in the song DNA, he says, "I got power, poison, pain, and joy inside my DNA." And when he says, "I got power, poison, pain, and joy inside my DNA," he's not simply illustrating his incredible alliteration skills, right? He's actually showing you the complexity of what it means to be a human being. He's actually showing you how self-aware he is and how aware he is of the fact that he has the capacity to build up and to destroy. He has the capacity to tear down and to uplift. And this capacity exists within every single one of us as human beings, right? So part of self-awareness and part of introspection, on my part, for example, is being aware of the fact that I can behave in a good, positive way, and I can also behave in a negative, harmful way. I am capable of doing both. And also my peer, my friend, or whomever I encounter in life is also capable of doing both, right? One of the problems that we encounter, especially, for example, on social media, let's say if we were to get into conflict with someone, let's say that someone is acting aggressive in that particular moment. We tend to, and this is just human nature, we tend to pigeonhole, right, or stereotype or box that person in. Oh, that person is behaving badly right now, then that person is only capable of behaving badly for the rest of his or her life, right? But that's actually not true. That's not what the human condition is. And so just being aware of that also encourages us to not stereotype, not pigeonhole, and not box in one another. So that's the first principle. The second principle, criticize to uplift and empower, never to tear down and never to destroy, is all about intention and being intentional when we need to criticize someone for their behavior, right? This is probably my favorite principle because it's very much empowering. So a pop culture story that I like to talk about for this principle is the story of Maya Angelou and Tupac. So the story goes that Maya Angelou and Tupac were on the same film set. And Maya Angelou saw Tupac from a distance, and he was having a verbal like altercation with another gentleman on set. And they were like sort of cursing under their breath, mumbling under their breath. Obviously, Maya Angelou is Maya Angelou, so she didn't like that, right? And so she says to him, come over here, let me talk to you, let me talk to you. And he's still kind of mumbling under his breath. And she says, come over here, let me talk to you, let me talk to you. And finally he comes over and she says, don't you know that my generation is looking to your generation to lead us forward? My generation is looking to your generation to carry the torch forward. And so we have our hopes and our dreams actually rest upon your shoulders. Imagine Maya Angelou comes over to talk to you and tells you something like that, right? It can be very intimidating on a certain level, but it can also be very ennobling on another level. And so the story goes is that in the very next moment, after she told Tupac this, Tupac started crying because no one had ever criticized him in a manner that was demonstrative of their belief in him, right? So you criticize someone because you believe in them, not because you want to tear them down and not because you want to destroy them. So the next day, Tupac, it's not like Tupac is now buddy-buddy with this other guy, right? That's not how it works. But after he's sort of still mumbling under his breath about this other guy, when he sees Maya Angelou in the hallway, he physically straightens up and he says, good morning, Miss Angelou. And he makes sure to comport himself in a way that is at once with the standard that Maya Angelou sort of projected onto him because she believed in him, right? So his behavior literally changes in the face of someone who believes in him. In contrast, when one criticizes in a way to tear down, it can have a very negative effect. Because, in fact, Maya Angelou has another quote where she says, if you tell someone over and over again that they are nothing, that they are less than nothing, that they count for nothing, they will say, oh, you think I am nothing? I will show you where nothing comes. And then they will become even lower than what you have accused them of being. And the moral of the story is that a person cannot develop character unless they are valued. Now, this can seem counterintuitive, and again, this is why it's sort of contrary to human nature. If someone is being sort of has animosity toward me for no real reason, right? I can feel justified in simply cursing that person out and moving on with my day, right? That wouldn't necessarily be productive, but I can feel justified because I didn't do anything wrong. That person has wronged me. Or I can say to that person, look, what you're doing is harmful behavior. It's unacceptable. It's inappropriate. And by the way, I'm not just telling you this because you have made me feel bad. I'm telling you this because I see your potential. And I know that you are capable of greater than this, right? People will rise or fall according to your level of expectation. So that's the second principle. It's very powerful. I have many stories where you can see its effect in the real world. And obviously, even though that story was about Maya Angelou and Tupac, were about two influential people, that was a real world story, right? And not within the context of a fictional pop culture situation. Okay, so the third principle, root everything you do in love and compassion, is really the culmination of the first two principles that they've been moving in this direction. And it's a continuation of the second principle. And that is to say that after you have that experience with the person where you tell them, you know, it's inappropriate what you're doing, but I'm telling you this because I believe in you and I want you to succeed, you can also then invite that person to come break bread with you, right? You can also then invite that person to come enjoy a meal with you, have a drink with you, etc. And I find that this works even when it comes to, let's say, disputes in the workplace. You wanted to be on a certain page, your colleague was not on another page, you we're frustrated about this, right? But instead of ignoring that person and being passive aggressive, say to that person, let's actually have lunch. Let's talk about this. Let's talk about how we can sort of merge our different styles and try to work together. So it works in the context of the workplace. It also works within the context of politics. So you have two people disagreeing with each other. The point of this exchange is not for us to come to an agreement. The point of this exchange is for us to reintroduce compassion and empathy, even in the midst of profound disagreement, right? So a pop culture reference that I always love to tell that really illustrates this is the story of Moana. Now, I don't know how many of the wonderful audience members have seen Moana. I usually like to poll the audience to see how many people have seen Moana. You'd be surprised. But, okay. But Moana is incredible. I saw it on a plane the first time I saw it. I was like, oh my goodness, do we realize what Disney is trying to do here? So I'm just going to explain to you briefly the premise of Moana. So for those who may not have seen it. So Moana is a young girl. She's the daughter of the chief, so she's basically the princess, and her island is dying. And the reason why her island is dying is because there was a good goddess who was in charge of the island, and this goddess's name is Tafiti, but her heart was taken from her. And it was taken from her by a demigod named Maui. And the reason why this heart was taken from her was because the heart had power in it. But once the heart was taken from her, Tafiti was replaced by an evil lava-breathing goddess named Taka, who basically turned the island into ruin. And so the whole storyline is about Moana finding the heart and restoring the heart of Tafiti. Now, in the last scene of Moana, and this is a spoiler alert for those of you who haven't seen it, I apologize, but it is your fault. Okay, so in the last scene of Moana, Moana has this aha moment. So she's holding the heart in her hand, and she sees Taka from a distance. Again, this fire, lava-breathing, really terrifying goddess. And she has this aha moment, and she says to the water, because the water is animated because it's a Disney movie, she says to the water, let her come to me. So the waters part, and there's no longer a real distance between Taka and Moana. So Taka starts to come really angry, fire raging, breathing, etc. And as she comes, Moana says, well, she sings something, but I'm not going to sing it because that would be terrifying for the audience. I'm going to say it. She says, I have crossed the horizon to find you. I know your name. They have stolen the heart from inside you, but this does not define you. Now, I'm going to table this for a quick moment, and I'm going to bring you out of Moana into the real world so you can see the parallel. And tell you a quick story where this is a one-to-one correlation. At the University of Florida, a couple years ago, there was a neo-Nazi who came to speak. And there were hundreds of people protesting this person. And there was one guy by the name of Anthony Furness, who at the time was a neo-Nazi and had Nazi symbols all over his shirt, wanted to go see him speak. But in order to see him speak, he had to go through the sea of protesters in order to get to him. Once he gets to the sea of protesters, the protesters start punching him, kicking him, cursing him out, etc. One man by the name of Anthony Courtney, an African-American man, sees him, has no idea what to do. He sees a person who hates him for his skin color. So he does the only thing he is moved to do in that moment, which is to say that he hugs him. He pulls him close to him, and he says to him, why do you hate me? Why do you hate me? Why do you hate me? He asks him 3 times. And at this point, Randy Furness, the guy in the neo-Nazi's t-shirt, has no idea what to do because the object of his hatred is hugging him. And so he does what he is moved to do, the only thing he is moved to do in that moment, which is to say that he hugs him back. And he simply responds by saying, I don't know. And this very simple exchange totally transforms the life of Randy Furness, who has since then disavowed his ties to the white nationalist movement and has made steps to work on furthering a relationship, bettering a relationship with the African-American community in that area. It is as if Anthony Courtney, when he saw this man, had a very similar moment that Moana had when she saw Taka, which is to say, it is as if he saw him and said, I have crossed the horizon to find you. I know your name. They have stolen the heart from inside you, but this does not define you. right? So although Randy Furness was acting badly in that moment, Aaron Courtney believed in his capacity to change. And that is what actually enabled him to change. And to really round it out, the aha moment that Moana had was that Taka and Tafiti were actually the same exact goddess. And once the heart was taken from Tafiti, she transformed into Taka. She became Taka, this crazy, rageful, deteriorating person who destroyed everything around her. So it was just a metaphor for the human condition, which is what Disney does, right? So I want to get to more of your questions, but that's the theory of enchantment, as supplemented by the various pop culture references in a nutshell.
Thank you so much, Chloé. That was excellently said. Very moved by the examples you gave. Just to recap on my side, and it's amazing how actually the third principle ties right back to the first one. So you started with kind of calling us to remember the fact that everyone is complicated. It's not like they're just one thing or the other thing. It's just, we all know deep inside, we have our good days and bad days, our good sides and bad sides. And just as we're like that, so is everybody else that we interact with. So don't box people in and see them for the more complex human condition that we all have. And then with that in mind, whenever you are going to criticize somebody, to point out something that they could do better, if you actually ground it just in something positive, and based on an intention and an objective, your belief in their potential and so on, it's much more likely to lead to a positive outcome. Even if you want that selfishly for yourself, for this person to do something better, it's much better to, kind of set a high bar for them and tell them, like, this is what I believe you're capable of, as opposed to saying, wow, you did that wrong, you're terrible. And then when you treat people that way, then they're going to act terrible. They're going to, you've already set low standards for them. And then finally, it's just approaching things with love and compassion, even where it seems like it's really not deserved whatsoever. So that was very powerful. I think we all can resonate these, like, all of it is like common sense, but the stories you tied it to Moana, Tupac, and Kendrick Lamar, I think those were really excellently done. One question I have for you is, what makes this so hard? This is like kind of when you speak about these examples where everything then worked out so well.
Sure.
Sometimes the people we're up against, in a conflict situation, they really do seem like they have no good intentions. They're looking to tear you down, and they like it really is like it feels like you're up against like a wall. Like this person is not open to listening to reason and so on. I think that's when it's really hard to overcome conflicts, when like someone, if somebody like that you potentially hate theoretically or whatever, if they hug you, okay, that's one thing. But if they're actually, metaphorically or for real kicking you down, then it becomes much harder. So wanted to hear your thoughts on, when you're up against, someone who is not willing to kind of budge based on these principles.
Yeah.
What's your, so is it just that with some people, it's just not worth it? It's not like you can only go so far, or do you think that at the end of it, you can get through to everyone? It's just a question of how long it takes or how you do it.
So that's a great question. And I get this question a lot. I think there's a two-part answer to this question. The first part is, I think every situation is situational, right? And I think that it's incumbent upon the individual to use discretion, right? In the example that I gave you about Randy Furness and Aaron Courtney, Aaron Courtney felt safe enough and, protected enough to make that happen, to engage in that type of behavior with the hugging. It's possible that you can find yourself in a similar situation where you do not feel safe enough. That is a discretion that you have to use on your own, and you have to use, just basic wisdom. I will say, with the caveat that there have been individuals who were in a relatively unsafe environment. Two individuals come to mind. One is Dia Khan, who's a very famous Netflix filmmaker who has filmed us on a similar topic. And there's another individual, Daryl Davis, who basically infiltrated just as one black man infiltrated several white nationalist groups, and over the course of 20 years got over 200 of them to leave the movement, right? So there are examples where the situation was relatively unsafe and they still put themselves in that position and were able to get through. And they weren't able to get through to all of them, but they were able to get through to a great deal of them. So it's a balance of discretion, but also maybe pushing the edge. And I should also add, I'm giving a very dramatic example, right, of racism, of dealing with racism. So then the question becomes, well, how much more easier or simpler can it be if you're dealing with a dispute not on that existential level, right? A regular workplace dispute, a regular dispute with a colleague, a regular dispute with someone who cut you off in traffic, whatever, from just not looking over his shoulder or whatever. So I'm giving you a dramatic example to illustrate how much more easier it might be to apply these principles in a less dramatic situation. But if you find yourself in a more dramatic example like the one that I described, I think, again, you use discretion, but you use wisdom, you use personal judgment, but you also should consider that there have been people who were in relatively unsafe situations that were still able to make change happen over time. The other thing to consider is that if the person is, let's say, hard-headed, you're not just modeling this behavior in order to get them to change. You're also modeling this behavior so that the people around you see that there's another way, potential way of being, right? So in that sense, the objective may not just be to get that person to change or to persuade that person to change. The objective may also be to get other people around you to see that there is a way to not fly off the handle in these aggressive situations. There is a way to keep your cool, to maintain emotional regularity, which is healthier in general, whether or not that person decides to change. So those are the two things I would say to consider.
Absolutely. I had an opportunity to meet Daryl Davis and hear.
Oh,
his
very
story.
cool.
So that's an incredible example of someone, leading with love and compassion, and just seeing so many people resonate with that who you would otherwise never think would be capable of that. So
exactly.
Great examples. I can share with you personal experiences from my side. While you were speaking, I was really thinking about, I've been running my own business for many years. There's a lot of situations where you need certain things done and you're depending on a lot of people to get them done. And sometimes, it's very frustrating. Both, when your expectations aren't being met, but also a lot of people are counting on you. You're not meeting their expectations. I couldn't think of a single situation in which, when I lost my temper or when I started talking about whenever I took a negative approach internally, or when someone took a negative approach with me, can't think of a single situation where everybody thinks it's carrots and sticks. You got to use both. And that's true to some extent, but even if it's a stick, I've found that the most effective I've always been is when I can focus on, hey, forget about me and you. Let's just forget about what is the goal here.
Yeah.
Just recenter ourselves. What is the goal that we're trying to get to? And what am I capable of? What are you capable of to get there, right? And I think whenever I've done that, it's been the most powerful thing. And whenever I fail to do that, which still happens, it always becomes more of you said, and you're unreasonable and so forth, as opposed to what are we even talking about? What are we trying to get to? So I can definitely personally resonate big time with everything that you mentioned. So we've got one audience question that I want to dive into already. And everybody else who's listening, if you have any questions, feel free to type them in the Q&A box in the middle bottom of the screen. So the first question is as follows. What do you think about how broadly we now apply the word toxic to relationships and friendships? Is there a good way to know the difference between just normal disagreements and a totally deadlocked relationship when your emotions are running high?
That is a great question. So I have to say, I haven't done any in-depth study on how frequent we have been using the word toxic. I know it's probably more frequently used in the current zeitgeist. I can imagine that it's abused to a certain extent. It's interesting. I can try to answer this just from my experience being on social media and seeing the use of this word in high use. I think that a lot of toxic behavior that is described as such is often indeed toxic, but it's sort of not the point, right? Meaning a behavior can be toxic, but if you don't believe in the person who's behaving in this way, if you don't believe in their capacity to change, right? And if you don't speak to that potential and capacity to change, and you're only talking about the nature of the behavior, i.e. that it's toxic, then the question begins to be, to what extent is this conversation solution oriented? And to what extent is it simply problem oriented, where we talk about the problem ad nauseum, right? And we also do only a superficial reading of the problem. So there are cases, I think, in which a person is engaging in toxic behavior and they have to be removed, right, from the room, or from whatever environment they're engaging in that toxic behavior. That has very little to do with the question of whether or not that person can change, right? Which is the question I'm trying to get people to start thinking about and get, I guess, society to start moving towards, especially because some of the work I do, in addition to being centered on, let's say, the workplace and also education, is also focused on criminal justice reform, right? And criminal justice reform is premised on the idea that people can change. There's an incredible podcast called Ear Hustle, which takes place in San Quentin Prison, which I encourage all of your listeners to follow. It's an amazing podcast, and it's co-hosted by a prisoner inside the prison. And they're just talking about prison life. They're just talking about what it's like, how difficult it is to do like the basic things. And it is in no way, shape, or form absolving of the crimes that were committed, right? Sometimes people conflate humanizing with excusing toxic behavior, right? And that's not what it is at all. It's actually making people understand that even toxic behavior is a very human thing, right? It's not other, it's not separate. It's not a thing that is abnormal in the human sense of the word, right? That goes back to the song DNA. We are capable of doing good and bad. That is what it means to be human, right? So the co-host of this podcast actually ended up getting his sentence commuted by the governor of California because of the popularity and the humanization of the community in question. So I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with describing behavior as toxic if it is problematic. The problem becomes when we don't move from talking about a problem to talking about a solution, and to trying to see how we can have a holistic approach to dealing with toxic behavior in a way that restores the person who was harmed, right? But also, if possible, restores the person who did the harming. And that's how we come to a holistic approach to dealing with things like toxic behavior.
Love that. Thank you so much, Chloe, and thank you for that wonderful question to the person who asked it. I've got another question for you. I've been getting comments here about the pop culture references.
Okay.
And you and I were speaking before we went live today about how, of course, you can learn a lot from Plato and Socrates and people who lived, hundreds or thousands of years ago. But also we can learn a lot from the people who are speaking the truth today. But there might be a lot of noise also because, it hasn't really been filtered by the sands of time. Just curious, as we look around and, our current environment and current pop culture, who do you think are the people that might be remembered and also the lessons that they'll be remembered by? Maybe like a top three.
Top three, that's hard. That's interesting. Okay. I think, so it's just off the top of my head, I think if you're familiar with The Breakfast Club and Charlemagne, who's the host of The Breakfast Club, which is a popular sort of like radio show, Charlemagne has been talking increasingly about just voicing the fact that he sometimes suffers from anxiety and depression, which can be culturally taboo in the African American community. And so he talks about like how he goes to therapy now on a regular basis, and how he had to learn how to deal with that and voice that. Now, I don't know if he's going to be remembered 100 years from now or 200 years from now, but I do think he is setting a precedent that will have an effect 200 years from now. So I don't know if his name specifically will be remembered, but I think that the fact that he's bringing this to the forefront is something that is going to set a precedent. So that's one person. Ooh, this is hard. I mean, I do think Beyonce will be remembered just because, for obvious reasons. I mean, I don't think I really have to explain this. I think it's like, again, you know it when you see it. Beyonce will be remembered for a very long time after her generation. And I think it's because of a whole host of things. It's because of the sort of like the symbolism that she brings, the type of representation that she brings, the type of confidence that she represents and that she brings and that she sort of transmits to other people, which is the symbolism is deliberate on her part as an artistic direction choice. But so I think she'll be remembered. And she's doing a lot of interesting work, or her family is doing a lot of interesting work, actually, when it comes to mental health, criminal justice reform, and just thinking of like health and wellness, which will be fascinating to watch in the long run. And let's see, a third person. Does it have to be a person? Or, Oh, I think Brene Brown will be remembered. I think the power of vulnerability, her TED Talk was very much groundbreaking, and I think it caused the ripple effect, and I think it's that we're still sensing like the effects of that ripple effect. And yeah, I think she'll be remembered. And I don't know if she'll be remembered for all of her other stuff, but I think the power of vulnerability, that TED Talk was super impactful and super salient. And will continue to resonate with future generations, regardless of their age or ethnicity or other demographic factors.
Right. And coming back to your definition of the word enchantment, right? It's all about people, also brands and companies, but people who give us that almost either permission to be confident, permission to achieve our dreams, or permission to share our weaknesses. Yes. All three examples you gave had that in common. So I love that. Got two more questions here that have come up. First one is as follows. What would you say to people who might say that when it comes to prejudice and discrimination, the burden shouldn't be on the person who's the victim of the prejudice to humanize themselves to others? Even if that works, is it too much to ask?
I love this question. So let me make sure I understand it. Is the burden on the person who is being oppressed, essentially, to humanize?
Well, yeah, it's kind of like, just to repeat the question, should the burden be on the person who's the victim? Like if someone is getting prejudiced against, should they be trying to humanize themselves to others?
Right.
Not too much to ask, or what do you think?
So I'm gonna quote James Baldwin to answer this question. And you don't have to agree with it, but it's something to think about. So James Baldwin was in a debate in Cambridge in, I don't know, the 60s. And in his speech, he gave a very interesting description of what was then at the time the typical like Southern white races. And he said, if you think about this person, the sheriff in this town, who presumably loves his wife and loves his children, and comes home at night and is glad to be in the company of these people, and yet at the same time can use his power, use his gun, use his weapon to harm another person because of his skin color. So this is where the controversial part comes in. This is James Baldwin saying this, okay? He says, in a certain way, it is much worse for the soul of the sheriff than it is for the person he is beating. Because what does it say about the person who loves his wife and loves his children and loves his family, that same person can then take a weapon and harm another person? What does it say about the deterioration of the internal, presence of that person, right? And Baldwin argues that it is much worse for him internally, spiritually, if you will, than for the person he harms. Now, I think that that's up for debate. That's a controversial statement, but it's an interesting question, and I bring it up because it's related to this formulation of the question presented here, which is centered around the term burden, right? Who is the burden on? And that's why I paused to think about that particular use of terminology, because from my perspective, let's say, if I was verbally accosted by someone who is a racist, right? From my perspective, and I say this as someone who is working with an organization to actually rehabilitate former white nationalists back into society, which is part of the work that I do. From my perspective, understanding mental health and understanding that, number one, extremism is very similar to alcoholism. So former extremists will say this, that when they were in these movements, that was very similar to alcoholism in that they needed like a 12-step program to get out of it. So it's a moral problem, but it's also a health problem, right? And so it's interesting to think of extremism in that way, as a mental health problem, right? So from me as someone who's fairly healthy mentally, encountering a person who's exhibiting behavior that I would probably argue is not healthy from a mental perspective, I would actually say that it's not a level playing field in that sense, meaning I am healthy, this person is not healthy, right? So on one level, this person is attacking me because of my skin color, and I could be the victim of that. On another level, and I would argue on a more deeper level, this person is mentally unhealthy, and I am seeing the world in a much more sensible lens, and this person, for whatever reason, is not, and is affected by what I would actually call a mental health deficiency. And in that case, the question doesn't really become, at least from my perspective, is the burden on me to sort of get myself out of the situation, or to correct this person, or to educate this person? The question becomes, how can I help this person, right? Because I know that everything they're saying is being filtered through a lens of that internal dynamic work. Another thing I should add, in case anyone's more interested in delving in this topic more deeply, the Theory of Enchantment has a podcast. And on this podcast, I actually interviewed a former white nationalist, where he described some of the things that were going on internally, and sort of how they manifested in external behavior, right? So I say all that to say, the perspective that I'm coming from is asking myself the question, what are the dynamics at work within this person that is producing this negative behavior? The negative behavior is just a product of a deeper thing happening within. And so then the discussion is, from my perspective, is not about burden or unburden. The perspective is something unhealthy is happening here. And if I can in any way, shape, or form ameliorate that, then we will both be better off. And I think society will be better off in the long run. Now, people are free to disagree or refuse to adopt that position, but I will say that almost every situation that I've seen where people interfered in the process of extremism, and were able to successfully get people out of those movements, this was their mindset. Not simply being like, oh yes, I'm gonna take you at face value, everything you're saying, and just exit myself out of the situation, but to think deeply, is there something about insecurity that's going on within this person that's making this person overcompensate for his sense of insecurity, and that's why he's projecting this insecurity onto me, right? Is there an inferiority complex that you're projecting onto me? And so is there actually, underneath all of this brash talk about superiority, a feeling of deep inadequacy? And if so, how can I challenge that? Do I challenge that by continuing to tear you down and telling you that you are inadequate? Or do I challenge that by saying your behavior is inappropriate, but you are capable of more than this, right? It can seem counterintuitive, but I think once you get to the internal, it makes a lot of logical sense.
I love that. And fascinating also, the James Baldwin story that you shared at the beginning, because also it calls to question, like, yes, there's a clear victim here,
right,
on the one hand, but on the other hand, the person who's doing the victimizing is also a victim of something, because clearly something is very wrong with them internally that's causing them to have this love for their family and hatred for others. Excellent answer. Thank you so much. Next question, I'm going to paraphrase here, also share a bit of my experience. Interestingly, I'm originally from Turkey, and I grew up abroad, and I got to study in the US, and it was always interesting to see people who are supposed to have conflicts, national conflicts, religious conflicts, and so on, but outside of the setting of their home countries or home places, when they're studying abroad somewhere, Greeks and Turks are usually the very best of friends. And then
Okay.
a lot of Jews and Arabs, a lot of,
Mhm.
I mean, you named the examples, right? Like
Yeah.
Korean and Japanese and whatever have you, like people who've had national conflicts or, could be ethnic conflicts. But then outside of on an individual level, there's countless examples of like individuals having zero issues. In fact, sometimes being very close because actually culturally they are quite close. But in these group settings, there's this issue of herd mentality and what Aldous Huxley called, the madness of the crowds, like where individuals behave not, they're human and they follow these, like a lot of the principles you mentioned, but in groups, sometimes they act in ways that are completely, counter to how an individual would generally behave. Curious, especially when it comes to conflict resolution, it's one thing between conflict between two people,
Sure.
and then conflict between two groups of people, sometimes abstractly grouped because of things like borders or skin color or whatever have you. And then, they're supposed to be a part of this bigger conflict, that they just happen to have been born into. Curious, how you navigate within your theory of enchantment, the difference, like when it becomes a group conversation where people are saying about their side as opposed to the two individuals in question.
So group dynamics pose a different set of challenges. I think that groups can be both empowered and exploited for whatever outcome is desired. So one of the things I was frequently doing when I was developing the research on this was actually going to a lot of DJ parties in Brooklyn, because I was just fascinated by the ability of the DJ to get the group, so to speak, to perform in a certain way. And it's different because in that setting, the group tends to be super empathetic, right? And to be super open and to be super tribal, but not in the way that we understand tribal in a conflict-oriented setting. So I think that taught me a lot about, this is where I think leadership and management skills come into the situation, because even when you're talking about groups that are in conflict, let's talk about, for example, Rwanda, for example, when you had the leadership fomenting hatred in one group against another group. I think that obviously when a group sort of gets whipped into a frenzy, then it can have deleterious effects. But the entry point into that being whipped into a frenzy still comes from a leadership position, right? And so this illustrates why it becomes even more important for those in leadership positions who are perhaps maybe in charge of groups or managing groups to be aware of their influence on the group in question and aware of how to build culture and how not to build culture, right? And so I think that whether you're talking about in a workplace setting, in a school setting, or even, and this is sort of like really optimistic, but even in a country setting, the president, the prime minister has a responsibility, right, to be aware of that group dynamic that's sort of built in with us. We have an innate tendency to be tribal, and to guide it in a responsible way. So after the genocide in Rwanda, the new president actually said, we are going to bring in sociologists and psychologists and pastors into the prisons, and we're going to get them to talk to the prisoners, because at that time it was basically a fire hazard how many prisoners they had. And we're going to do this radical thing where we let out thousands of ex-murderers back into Rwandan society. But before we do, we're going to, again, get them counseling from the therapists and such in question. And these individuals, these groups of people are going to have to meet with the family members of the person they harmed and ask for forgiveness. And they're going to have to physically be active in restoring the homes of the people whose homes they destroyed. And what happened, this is interesting because this is an example of a country engaging in group dynamics, right? But again, the entry point was leadership. What happened was nothing short of, I would argue, miraculous, because not only did, when they asked for forgiveness, were they forgiven, but in many cases, in hundreds of cases, the family members who had lost their, those who had lost their family members ended up adopting those who had asked for forgiveness as their own family members. So there's actually an interesting photojournalist entry in the New York Times a few years ago that had a series of photos of the family member of a victim and the ex-murderer who had done the killing. And you saw that years later that these people were in closely tight-knit relationships. And in some cases, the mother had ended up adopting this person who had murdered her son as her own son. Now that's radical change and transformation and compassion. But we often talk about the things that human beings are capable of doing in terms of the negativity, but we don't talk, I think, as much about the things we're capable of in terms of transformation. And I think that's a great example of just leadership and, not to reduce it to quote unquote management skills, but an incredible leader deciding to, first of all, being aware of the group dynamic and being aware of our ability and our instinct to be tribal, but not exploiting that instinct, right? Nelson Mandela did it as well in South Africa when he became prime minister. And so that, which is to say that it's often the case that groups do tend to take on a life of their own, but usually after an entry point has been established. And so it's incumbent upon, again, on a less dramatic scale in the workplace, managers making sure that this type of behavior is built into the culture, so that if a conflict arises, the group takes on a life of its own, that group is informed by that culture, right? And that group is more primed to be empathetic and to be more open, just like that group I encountered on the dance floor in Brooklyn.
All right. And I love how this ties together, because the three principles you shared at the beginning of this conversation, those are very individually applicable, but for those of us, which is most Ivy members in leadership positions of different kinds, you have to also not just espouse those values and principles yourself, but also you need to make sure you're creating a culture where that's like the default mode for the people who are following you or who are a part of your organization. And it's a pretty cool visual to, I guess, think for yourself as the DJ, trying to create an environment to get people to quote unquote dance and get along, as opposed to causing a fight. And clearly some leaders are more interested in the latter, right? But that's makes it even more important for other leaders to counteract that. So I guess to summarize your answer, groups can go either way in either extreme. They can go very negative, but they can also go very positive, like the Rwandan aftermath that you mentioned and the reconciliation there. Very quickly, we've got one short question, which was, what was the name of the podcast that you mentioned about in California with the prisoners?
Oh, it's called Ear Hustle.
Ear Hustle. Okay, awesome. Thank you. And the final question, if you could give a quick answer to this before we wrap up. The question was as follows. You mentioned the effects of social media on connection. There's been a lot of talk about how the first generation to grow up in a world that always had the internet has struggled with higher rates of depression and loneliness, as well as experienced social anxiety and political partisanship. What are your thoughts? Do you find the situation that dire?
So I just recently interviewed social psychologist Jonathan Haidt at NYU, who has written a lot of books on this. His last book, The Coddling of the American Mind, was specifically about this, which argues that it's been a combination of things, so social media, but also parenting, in the sense that we've gotten sort of overprotective in our parenting behavior, and so that once a iGen or Generation Z student gets to college, this is the first time they're independent, and that independence can feel very terrifying, basically because they've received no independence as a child or a preteen or a teenager. So it's a combination of parenting and social media. So I would say I would personally defer to him, because he studied this not only in America, but also in the UK, Australia, and New Zealand. And it's apparently happening in major Western countries. In terms of how dire do I think it is, I'm an eternal optimist. So I think that these things can be hacked. Will we hack them is a different question. Can they be hacked? I think they can be. But I do know that I like the ways in which they would be hacked is like you can't for schools to adopt the policy of you can't have your phone on in the class. Like you have to drop your phone into a bin, just like some comedians make you drop your phone into a bin once you go to their shows. Or you cannot have a cell phone or a smartphone until you are 16 years old, right? So like there are ways that parents can get involved and influence their kids by mandating that, and there's ways that schools can get involved by saying you just can't have your cell phone on the premise at all, or you have to lock it up. So those are some recommendations I would give. But I would say look up Jonathan Haidt, read his latest book, The Coddling of the American Mind, because he has a lot of really extensive research that looks into how widespread the effect of social media is on shaping the lives of iGen. And it's interesting because a lot of people in the media conflate it with millennials. It's not millennials. It's actually the generation afterwards, because millennials, which I'm one, we actually grew up with dial-up. So we know of a time where social media did not exist. But iGen is the generation that knows only of a time when social media existed. So look into Jonathan Haidt.
Absolutely. I pasted in the chat window for everybody the Atlantic article on coddling of the American mind. That's a whole other conversation we can have another time, Chloé. It would be fascinating. Before we wrap up, you've been incredibly generous with your time and your insights. Really, really appreciate it. Would love to hear from you how the Ivy community can best support you. I know that you have a startup initiative that you're working on. And so would love to hear kind of like how we can support you, and then any final words of wisdom to share with Ivy members before we wrap up for today.
Sure. So startup, if you want to check it out, it's theoryofenchantment.com. One of the things that I'm trying to do is get schools to license the full curriculum. So what you got today was just a snippet, but the full curriculum is a really engrossing, in-depth way to teach self-care and healthy identity formation. If you're a company and you're interested in bringing me in, please feel free to visit the website. There's a form you can fill out to make that happen. And in terms of final words of wisdom, remember that the things that we consider, there are certain concepts in life that we consider to be timeless. As I said before this talk occurred, we consider, people like Plato and Socrates and such individuals who have created timeless concepts. But if they're timeless, that means that we should be able to find them today in contemporary life. So do not be dismissive of pop culture when you are engaging, when you are, trying to entertain yourselves, and you're at the movie theater and you're listening to music. Remember that certain artists and influencers are actually trying to teach you things. So consume pop culture, not passively, consume it with intent, and consume it with the idea that you can actually get something out of it, and try to see how you can apply it in your life in different ways to the edification and to the benefit of your life.
Excellent. Thank you, Chloé. This was incredibly inspiring, educational, and truly meaningful and impactful for me, and I believe for everybody who got to participate today. So excited to spread your message around the country and around the world, and wish you the very best with your endeavors. Hope to see you in person soon.
Thank you.
All right, all the best, and thank you everybody for dialing in. Until next time, take care everybody. Bye-bye.